For generations, Minnesota farmers have made a habit of mowing and making hay from the grass growing in roadside ditches. But in the past year, state officials began increasing awareness of an existing but largely unpublicized and unenforced law that had, since the mid-1980s, required farmers to obtain permits for such work.
There's been a greater emphasis of understanding what all of the different benefits that occur in the right-of-way. And probably the largest has been expansion of interest to spread out to pollinators, the monarch butterfly. And that escalation really had other people coming to the department and asking us to step up the enforcement of the statutes that were in place.
State transportation officials say boosted enforcement guidelines would have required farmers to have, among other things, a $1 million liability insurance policy, with the state listed as one of those insured.
It was shocking to all of us that the permit had been on the books for a long time and never enforced or ever dealt with. We had never heard of it, period.
Grant Breitkreitz used to bale hay on 120 miles of roadside ditches in the early years of his cattle operation. The work returned more than 700 additional bales a year for feeding his cattle during the winter. According to state officials, the 1980s-era law was originally designed to give the offspring of ground nesting birds, like pheasants, time to hatch and move on before the ditches were mowed. Since the measure was rarely enforced, farmers mowed and made hay in the ditches in late June and July, as they had for generations. State Representative Chris Swazinski, who farms in southwest Minnesota, was frustrated with the ban on mowing and baling the ditches before August 1st, and was among the legislators who last spring successfully placed a one-year moratorium on all enforcement.
When someone goes in the ditch in the wintertime, we're the ones that go fix the ruts. We're the ones that replant the grass in those spots. We're the ones that pick up the garbage and all that. And so we've managed these ditches for the last 80 years. We think the department's just simply wrong to put this burdensome red tape on farmers when a system's already worked great for many years.
Swazinski is frustrated the state's roadside maintenance costs may increase if the work done by farmers in exchange for hay is delayed until late summer. However, state officials say the various interest groups will meet in the coming year to discuss the best strategy.
Ideally, we'd like to have a vegetation management plan for our roadsides and doing maintenance when it's called for, when it's right, to get the desired result that we want. I'm not saying that haying isn't a portion of that. Haying is a management technique that can be used. It just has to be done at the right time.
But defining that right time is where much of the dispute lies.
That time of year, especially a year like this where in our area we're very dry, the quality of the feed is deteriorated by that point. Any grasses that you're haying, as they mature and ripen, they become woody and dry and become less feed value and less palatable for the animals.
Neighboring South Dakota requires farmers in certain counties to wait on haying ditches until after June 15th or July 10th at the latest. Iowa allows those with a permit to bale hay along certain roads after July 15th. Minnesota farmers worry that leaving ditches unmowed until August could lead to the maturing, seeding, and spreading of noxious weeds.
The invasive species, mainly the Canadian thistle, is huge in Minnesota. Take over the ditches, and then it spreads into our fields and spreads into the other ditches.
But Minnesota officials say state maintenance crews could mow ditches earlier in the summer on a case-by-case basis. Farmers harvesting hay also have, at times, inadvertently hampered state road crews' efforts to manage weeds.
They'll go through and they'll apply herbicide, and no more than 2 hours later, there's a farmer in there haying it.
Proponents argue that several species, including the monarch butterfly, whose numbers are dwindling, have lost too much tall grass habitat in Minnesota. The state did lose about 700,000 acres of CRP ground between 1992 and 2012. However, over those 2 decades, much of the rural land went to new development, which increased by roughly 400,000 acres. The state also saw a slight increase in forest and pastureland acreage, while cropland decreased slightly. Farmers argue that unmowed ditches may mean motorists fail to see approaching deer and other wildlife, creating the potential for more accidents. Many established producers also worry that the younger and smaller acreage farmers will take the brunt of the delayed hay harvest.
I've got a neighbor down my road from my main farm who works in town as a plumbing and heating guy, but he also loves agriculture. He bought this acreage with his wife to raise a few goats on and some cattle, and quite frankly, he doesn't have the land to go out and just put up hay for winter.
Todd Thompson, who farms near East Chain, Minnesota, does harvest hay from the ditches adjacent to his land, but wouldn't be heartbroken if he lost the option to mow earlier in the summer. If he had to spend several $100s for a new insurance policy, he would stop haying ditches.
Oh, you're just in a tractor and you're on an angle, you know, and something could happen, something could break down, you might tip over. It's dangerous and it's hard.
As the interested parties debate the issue in the coming year, Minnesota will be under the legal microscope.
A lot of the other states were actually watching Minnesota this year to see how everything would pan out.
For Market to Market, I'm Colleen Bradford Krantz.